Hi, my name is Frederik Kamps, and thanks for coming to check out my talk. So, a now classic hypothesis is that human visual object processing involves a fundamental divide between systems for perception versus action, with the ventral vision for perception or recognition pathway critical for recognizing what kind of object you are looking at, for example, a cup and not a hammer, and the dorsal vision for action pathway critical for guiding how you can act on an object, so you can reach out and grab the handle on the right and not, for example, on the left. The strongest evidence for this hypothesis comes from neuropsychological work with patients with brain damage, showing that these abilities can be impaired independent of one another. For example, damage to the dorsal stream results in optic ataxia, an impairment in visually guided reaching, but leaves object recognition ability largely spared. By contrast, Milner and Goodale's famous patient DF was impaired in object recognition, but could nonetheless successfully reach out and grasp objects, essentially a double dissociation. Later work suggested that these two systems dissociate even in development, with the dorsal stream thought to undergo a relatively protracted development as compared with the ventral stream. Now, critically, almost all of this work has focused on object perception, yet the dorsal and ventral streams also contain regions that are not involved in object processing, but which rather respond selectively to places or scenes. These include the occipital place area, the OPA in the dorsal stream, and the PPA, or the parahippocampal place area, in the ventral stream. So this raises the question then, might there be an analogous what and how in scene processing, like object processing, such that this division between action and perception is truly a general organizing principle for the visual system? Well, in a series of recent fMRI studies, my lab has found evidence that these two scene systems do indeed show such a division of labor. Specifically, we've hypothesized that the PPA is critical for scene categorization, so recognizing that a scene is a kitchen and not a beach, whereas the OPA is instead critical for determining how to navigate through that scene past obstacles and boundaries in the environment. So this hypothesis clearly mirrors the division of labor between the dorsal and ventral streams more broadly. And further, it challenges the current view in the scene processing literature that all of these scene regions are primarily involved in navigation. Now, importantly, all of the evidence for this hypothesis to date comes from fMRI, so it's only correlational. Therefore, in the current study, we sought stronger evidence for this two scene systems hypothesis, and we did it in two ways. So first, we asked whether these systems are causally dissociable. That is, whether it's possible to find cases of damage impairing one system and consequently one ability, but not the other. And second, we asked whether these systems might even develop independently, and specifically with the dorsal navigation system maturing later than the ventral scene categorization system. Okay, so now let's turn to the first question. To test whether these systems are causally dissociable, we studied individuals with Williams syndrome. So Williams syndrome is a developmental disorder. It's caused by a microdeletion of about 28 genes on the long arm of chromosome 7. And most relevant to the current study, Williams syndrome involves cortical thinning in and around the dorsal stream, likely including OPA. So for this reason, we predicted that Williams syndrome adults would show impairment in visually guided navigation, but relative sparing in scene categorization. To study these abilities, we use two tasks. So in the first scene categorization task, participants viewed stimuli like these one at a time, and were asked to imagine standing in this space and to tell us whether they were looking out at a kitchen, as shown on the left, a living room, as shown in the center, or a bedroom, as shown on the right. And participants just shouted out their answer, which was recorded by the experimenter. Next, in the visually guided navigation task, the same participants looked at these exact same images, again one at a time, but now they were asked to imagine walking through that space and indicate which door they could reach along a complete path on the ground, either to the left, the center, or the right. Participants in the navigation task responded via pointing, which allowed us to rule out known deficits of spatial language ability in Williams syndrome. All other parameters were matched between the two tasks. Again, it's the same participants looking at the exact same stimuli, and both tasks involved 500 millisecond stimulus presentation and a non-speeded 3 alternative forced choice. Now, importantly, we chose these tasks based on previous work showing that these tasks differentially activate OPA and PPA and are matched for difficulty in typically developing adults. Okay, so with those tasks in hand, we can now ask the central question, is visually guided navigation ability impaired in Williams syndrome? Accuracy on the two tasks will be shown on the y-axis, and we compared the performance of Williams syndrome adults with a group of mental age matched controls. So these mental age matched controls were typically developing 7-year-old children who were matched participant by participant to the Williams syndrome adults based on their raw spatial IQ score, which we measured using the K-bit. Okay, so starting with the scene categorization task, we found no difference in performance between the two groups, suggesting that Williams syndrome adults categorize scenes accurately relative to their mental age. However, in the navigation task, we did find significantly lower performance in the Williams syndrome adults than the MA controls, and critically, we find a significant group by task interaction. So this finding suggests that Williams syndrome adults can accurately recognize places, but at the same time, they have difficulty using vision to plan how they would actually navigate through those same places. Essentially, evidence for a single dissociation between these two abilities. But let's think about this a little more closely. So are Williams syndrome adults doing well on the categorization task, not because they are doing well at recognizing that this is a bedroom, but instead because they can simply recognize a key object in the space, for example, the bed? Well, if so, then we might just be observing a dissociation of navigation ability and a general ability to recognize objects rather than scenes. So to test this idea, we devised a new scene categorization task in which all of the objects were removed from the rooms and where the rooms differed only in their spatial layout of major surfaces. So you'll note that these stimuli were also blurry, and we did that for two reasons. One is to ensure that performance remained in the sensitive range off of ceiling, and two, to further focus processing on the gist of the scene layout rather than any particular feature, which is consistent with ideas from the computational scene processing literature suggesting that gist recognition is critical to scene categorization. So for this new empty rooms task, we brought in a brand new sample of participants, allowing us to effectively replicate our findings, albeit with these slightly different stimuli. And we called the room on the left the boring room because it's just this standard square room. We called the room in the middle the hallway room because it has this hallway that goes off to the right. And we called the room on the right the stairs room because of the stairwell. For those wondering whether the stairs are an object or part of a scene, I'll tell you ahead of time that rerunning all of the analyses with this condition removed doesn't change the results. And then finally, for comparison, participants perform the same visually guided navigation task that I described before, and all other aspects of the design for this experiment were the same as in the previous experiment. Okay, so to remind you, here are the findings from the first study showing disproportionate impairment of Williams syndrome adults on the navigation task. So what happens on this new empty rooms task? Well, as you can see, we find essentially the same pattern of results. Comparing across experiments, there's no interaction of group or task with the experiment. Rather, we just see an overall group by task interaction, revealing that the spared performance of Williams syndrome adults on the categorization task was not driven by object perception and instead reflects better scene recognition ability than visually guided navigation ability. Okay. So finally, we considered two more alternative explanations for these findings. One possibility is that Williams syndrome adults are not impaired in visually guided navigation, but instead are impaired in a more general ability to distinguish left from right. So to address this possibility, we reanalyzed the navigation data, but now looked at the center trials only, where confusing left and right should not affect the results. And even in this case, we still saw impaired navigation ability relative to MA controls. I want to also point out that in this case, the navigation task is actually easier than the categorization task, as judged by the MA control data, and yet we still see that Williams syndrome adults are doing worse on this easier version of the navigation task. A second possibility is that Williams syndrome adults abilities reflect qualitatively different cognitive systems relative to typically developing populations, given that Williams syndrome is a genetic disorder, which could lead to totally different underlying cognitive systems. So if this is true, then you should expect that Williams syndrome adults and MA controls will do the task using totally different strategies. So we tested this possibility by looking at the pattern of performance across the different trial types of the navigation task, the left, the center, and the right trials. And we found that in fact, the two groups performed the task in the same way, actually doing best on the center trials. So this result suggests that the two groups are using similar strategies to solve the navigation task and begin to rule out the possibility then that Williams syndrome just involves a completely different underlying cognitive architecture. Okay, so taken together then, these results provide the first causal evidence dissociating these two scene processing abilities. And critically, of course, this is evidence of a single dissociation. So in ongoing work, we are searching for the complementary case of PPA damage to test the full double dissociation. Okay, moving to the next section of the talk, we can now turn to our second question, which is whether the navigation system might not only be more vulnerable to damage in Williams syndrome, but also slower to develop, even in typical development. To test this prediction, we compared the same MA control group showed before, who I'll remind you were actually typically developing 7-year-olds, with a group of younger, typically developing 4-year-olds. And we chose the 4-year-olds given evidence that other dorsal stream abilities in object processing are also still developing along this timeline. The two groups of children then perform the same categorization and navigation tasks that I described in detail before. So what did the data reveal? Well, as you will recall, the 7-year-olds, or who we formerly called the MA controls, were approximately matched in performance on the two tasks. So the question here is, how will the 4-year-olds perform? Well, if navigation develops later than categorization, then we should see that 4-year-olds perform much worse on the navigation task than the categorization task. And indeed, that's exactly what we found. And most importantly, we find a significant group by task interaction, confirming that the younger 4-year-olds actually do disproportionately worse on the navigation task than the categorization task relative to the older children. So these results are consistent with the idea that younger children's ability to accurately use vision to guide navigation is maturing more slowly than their ability to recognize what kind of place they're in. But could it be that this pattern of results in 4-year-olds on this furnished rooms task is just driven by earlier developing object recognition rather than scene categorization? Well, as before, we now brought in a new group of 4-year-olds and asked whether we could replicate our original result on this empty rooms task where no objects were presented. And looking at the data, we once again see that 4-year-olds do disproportionately worse on the navigation task relative to the older 7-year-old children, with no difference in the results across the two experiments. So these results effectively replicate our original findings and rule out object perception as an alternative account. Finally, we considered, again, a handful of alternative explanations, such as slow development of the ability to perceive left versus right, or the use of qualitatively different strategies in younger children relative to older children. And here again, in both cases, we found no evidence for the alternative explanation. So for example, we still saw disproportionately worse performance of 4-year-olds on the center trials of the navigation task, and we still saw qualitatively similar patterns of performance across the different trial types between the two groups. Importantly, though, for this developmental question, we also considered a third alternative explanation, slow development of executive function ability. So unlike Williams syndrome adults, 4-year-olds were not matched to older children on spatial IQ, leaving open the possibility that a more general executive function development could explain our results. For example, the navigation task, if you think about it, requires inhibiting 2 wrong answers, in this case the left and center doors, in order to select a third correct answer, the right door. And if you recall, the categorization task only ever involves one possibility presented on screen at a time. So to rule out this slow development of inhibitory processing, we brought in another group of 10 4-year-olds to perform a new phone task, where participants now had to indicate which outlet a phone was connected to along a complete wire. So as you can see, the phone task is matched to the navigation task in every way, except that it does not involve navigation. So if all we are tapping into here is inhibitory processing, then 4-year-olds should perform similarly on these two tasks. But instead what we saw is that 4-year-olds perform significantly worse on the navigation task than the phone task, suggesting that executive function can't explain our results and that this really is slow development of navigation specifically. So bringing all of this together then, here we find converging causal and developmental evidence suggesting that navigation and categorization depend on the dissociable scene processing systems. So this work reveals that scene processing is also divided into systems for action and perception, mirroring the division of labor for object processing, and thus suggesting that this division of labor between action and perception systems is truly a general organizing principle for the visual system more broadly. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thanks to everyone who contributed to this work, and I'm looking forward to any questions you might have. Thanks.